Good afternoon. The time is 4:43 p.m., Saturday, April 29th, 2023. My name is Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, and I am joined today by Investigator David Ballard. Both of us have been working incessantly to prove the innocence of Anthony Sanchez, a man scheduled to be executed by the state of Oklahoma in September. I serve as Anthony's spiritual advisor. We started this process a number of months ago after Anthony, for a long time, did not have interaction with his attorneys and to some degree did not have any level of representation. David came on to the case a few months later after we had raised some money and started to investigate the case himself. And so in this short amount of time, we wanted to take you through the evidence and why we believe that Anthony Sanchez is an innocent man. The entire situation began on December the 20th, 1996. A body was found by Lake Stanley Draper, not too far out of Norman, Oklahoma. After some time, the body was identified as Julie Buskin. Julie Buskin was a 21-year-old, 5'2", 140 pounds young woman. She had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. Her feet and her arms had been bound together. And it's important to point out that Julie Buskin was an incredibly accomplished person. She was a ballerina, an athlete. She had been recruited to the University of Oklahoma on scholarship and performed in dozens and dozens of ballets. She was graduating early, and just a week before this happened, she had performed the ballet Swan Lake. Now, on the morning of December the 20th, 1996, Julie arose to help a friend who was leaving town. When Julie returned to her apartment complex, it was very early in the morning, before daylight, and she met pure evil. The person who she met bound her, gagged her, put her in her car, drove her out to Lake Stanley Draper. There were witnesses who saw them driving towards Lake Stanley Draper, and perhaps some form of sexual assault took place and killed her. From there, the entire city of Norman, perhaps even the entire state of Oklahoma, went into an uproar. They wanted to know, how could this have happened? There was a real political pressure on investigators in Norman, cops in Norman, prosecutors, to find somebody. Who did this? Week turned into week, turned into month, turned into months, turned into year, turned into years. They were desperate. No question about that. They were desperate to find someone. And it was at that point that they began to act out of desperation. And David, could you tell us a little bit about some of those initial interactions that investigators would have had with DNA material and, trying their best to find someone and constantly seemingly bungling the investigation?
Yes. Well, the first thing to remember is that DNA evidence in use in criminal cases hadn't been in use that long. We're talking, this crime occurred in 96. The initial DNA reports or findings came along in late '97. But we're talking only like 6 years, really, that they were really being introduced into the system. And, matter of fact, there's a report wrote in 2007 by the FBI that talks about how people just didn't know. They were just out there, investigating their crime scene and collecting evidence. And there was things they didn't understand yet about DNA, about contamination, and how important it was to collect swabs a certain way. So,
David, what were they pulling DNA off of? I guess they found there was a leotard found at the scene, correct?
yes, leotard was one of the items. And now in that case, in crime scenes like modern day, you would collect the swabs there at the scene in their original form, and then you collect it and send it in, and then it's tested again, and that's to help preserve the samples just in case something did go wrong. In this case, it was they were gathered by detectives and sent to the Oklahoma City Crime Lab, and there they would draw swabs and send those swabs to OSPI to be tested, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. So it was a little different process. Some of that still happens, but the integrity of samples is even more protected now, and we have an understanding that wasn't around at that time, a full understanding that the importance of separate packaging, about letting samples dry that are wet in the air before packaging them. And, if you even look at DNA now, with how close they can come into the likelihood of a candidate versus back then, the numbers, it has increasingly gotten better, but a lot of it still relies on the initial collection, storage, and testing.
I mean,
there's been many books published from the American Academy of Forensic Science on strengthening forensic evidence in America, and it's I went through that training on some of that, and it was pretty cut and dry on how important it was that people just didn't know back then.
So tell me this. So they would have found this leotard with DNA on it in kind of a muddy, wet environment next to the Lake Stanley Draper, and from what I remember, there was she didn't have the leotard on, correct? That it was found near her body.
Well, it was near the scene, yes, where she was discovered, and that's again another common thing. You have your initial scene and it expands, but the item was found. I can't remember exactly how far, but it was within the scene, but a distance away from her and away from her car, or where her car would have been. Sorry.
Gotcha. And so would this have been a good environment for preserving DNA?
The temperature definitely helped. It was really cold that day. I think it was only like 20 degrees, which is helpful because cold, especially when you're talking about biological, is why they're frozen samples when they're collected later or at the lab. But that would help. But at the same time, you always have environmental concerns. The air, the contact with everything from animals to natural things around, and of course moisture is never a good thing in any situation, which requires before packaging to be let things air dry. And for instance, in crime scenes, you never put anything in plastic bags that's wet. You got to put it in paper, let it air, because you can contaminate the sample. But this whole scene, a body of water, there's no telling how many people travel through that area or other things. There's just a lot of things that can make it very difficult to preserve a sample.
Gotcha. And so, before we kind of move on to the way that the investigation went, the sample that was collected, the sample was not just a solid extraction of DNA. It was mixed DNA. And what does that mean, David? So
when you have mixed DNA, you have some things going on. One, you have two separate samples coming from two different contributors. So, which is common in assault cases and even in murder cases. So when you get those samples, the first sample, part of it's going to be uh, separating those samples and figuring out, which source and being able to identify that source. And it's very difficult with mixed samples to get a solid profile because of the fact that it is mixed, and you can have even cloning. You can have a more prominent sample from one contributor that tends to affect the sample from another. That's more likely when you have two male samples or two female samples. It makes it a little bit more difficult because you're dealing with someone of the same gender. But when you have mixed DNA, you can get profiles, but typically you're only going to get partial profiles. It's been said that it's pretty much impossible to get a full profile from a mixed DNA sample. From the training I've gone to and the information that I've received and knowledge that we've gained is that because it's mixed DNA.
I just want to make sure that we state that clearly. It is impossible to get a full profile from mixed DNA.
Yes.
All right, thank you. So, David, as the investigation continued, the typical investigatory, stuff happened. The car was, I guess, mined, if you will, investigated for fingerprints. We know that 49 fingerprints were found.
Yeah, something like it was a large number.
A huge number of fingerprints, and so those fingerprints were found. Then also shoe print was found, and then a cell phone was found to be missing, and so phone records were pushed for the phone, pursued for the phone, and. Was there any sort of hair or other types of DNA evidence found in the car?
There was some. So one of the things we talk about is epithelial, like skin samples or DNA that would come from a surface. Some of that was found both in Buskin's underwear, and then some things in the car. Some hairs were found, and as I understand it, they weren't matched to anybody. Besides, some things were matched to Julie, but nothing matched to Anthony.
Got you. Okay, and so even further than that, there were eyewitnesses who saw Julie and the perpetrator, and one eyewitness said that they saw an older man with Julie, and another eyewitness. From what I remember, it was Janice Merriman who described an older man with a younger woman turning onto Lake Stanley Draper Drive, heading in that direction. And what was interesting is that Miss Merriman, she described Julie's blue jacket and hairstyle to a T, and so. When she learned of the murder later, she goes to the police and she does a sketch. Another person by the name of David Keel remembered seeing Julie's car was a 1991 Eagle Summit, Arkansas plates, and David Keel saw her, an unfortunate name for this situation, but David Keel remembered seeing a little red car, and he saw the driver in a fit of road rage, and both Merriman and Kill come together to make a sketch of the driver, the man that they saw with Julie Buskin. And that sketch depicts someone who is certainly older, and certainly someone who had kind of sunken in cheeks. Like I said, looks like someone who is significantly older. Okay, let's leave that there. And I wanted to kind of push ahead, David. So when they got all of this evidence, they weren't able to find anybody, correct? I mean, there were no suspects, right?
No, matter of fact, even when they were comparing the DNA, they tested over 100 individuals against the DNA profile.
And that was in the Dragnet, correct?
Yeah, matter of fact, in one of the reports that I obtained, it was another individual they looked at, and he was, a pretty close match. And even in his DNA profile comparable to Julie Buskin and Anthony Sanchez, that's one of the issues that I observed when I first received the case and some of the documents. There were some issues right there as soon as you saw the way the profiles were coming out. But yeah, they tested over 100 people. Matter of fact, they even checked the fingerprints of the vehicle and items in there against all those fingerprints against Anthony, and they found no matches.
Wow. So in the months that followed, and I want to make this very clear for the listeners, Anthony Sanchez for years was never even a suspect in this case. What we're talking about is the police in Norman, prosecutors, investigators, they did not have any idea who this was, and when they did the Dragnet, tested hundreds of people, there were a lot of people who were very close and who were, could have been suspects. And I would even argue that perhaps if the DNA was bungled or manipulated or anything like that, perhaps some of these people that they found who were close matches were more likely to have been the killer than later on when Anthony Sanchez was assumed to be the killer. But with that said, David, now let me ask you this. So if you could help us understand, how did police investigators hone in on Anthony Sanchez?
Well, Anthony had, at the time, years later, around, I believe, 2002.
Now, it's important that people understand, 6 years after these events. So we're not talking about 6 months, 6 years after these events.
Anthony had, he was on a program where it's kind of like halfway house with very minimum security, where you check into a facility, but you were allowed to leave for work and other things. You can see a lot of transitioning out of DOC, which is Department of Corrections, things like that. And some of this, because we've been chasing some of the documents, and it's been kind of a slow process getting all the information outside of what was used for court. And Anthony had an ex-girlfriend that he had went and seen while he was on his work time. And, there's two different versions, but, one version is that Anthony went by and saw that she was staying in a house that had been Anthony's, that was, I believe, tribal housing. And he went by and seen her. And a week later, after that encounter, she goes in and claims that Anthony broke in and assaulted her. And then she would later recant the story and say that, that she basically made it up. And sadly, we can't interview her because she is deceased at this time. But one of the versions is that when he went and saw her, they did sleep together, and then she found out that he had another woman that he had a child with, and she became angry by that. So when she goes in and talks about to law enforcement about what happened, and I haven't got to see him yet, but there were some letters that she even wrote. She kept in contact with Anthony even after the sentence. Ultimately, they dropped the rape charge off Anthony and go for, I believe, second-degree burglary, which is, so in Oklahoma, anytime you have a violent crime or a violent offender, based off the statute, they can collect DNA swabs for. And this is an important factor in the timeline. Whenever I created my initial draft evaluation, this will come into play. Something that you and I have talked about is so the original ex-girlfriend goes in and states that she assaulted. They drop that, and they go for second-degree burglary. He agrees to sometime in, and partially because they were saying that him leaving other than work was a violation of his probation or his sentencing agreement. And there were some things that they thought were similar, but a week later she goes in. She also had thrown away, said, her underwear that she wore brings it in. There's no report on whether they collected anything from that. I don't believe they did. And then from there, they state that during a random search of DNA profiles of new violent offenders through OSBI, they get a hit through CODIS. And that the hit matches a profile that they have on record, which would have been Anthony's swabs that were collected when he would have went through processing for DOC. And that hit to an unknown perpetrator on Julie Buskin loaded into CODIS. The reports that I've seen that go along with that. So back then, Oklahoma wasn't processing right here. Those samples were taken in and they were shipped out to another lab. And when they went to that lab would do all these profiles for it and send it back. There was a lot of things going on in Oklahoma at the time, which is why they were shipping things out to other states, to this other lab to be tested and come back. So it wasn't immediate either. They came back and they said there are matching profiles to this crime or this perpetrator. One of the issues that I observed was, so in Oklahoma we use OSCN, Oklahoma Supreme Court Network, or ODCR, Oklahoma District Court Records. When you go and look up, the original version was that back in 2000, due to statute of limitations, the state or the prosecution opened up a case for a John Doe and loaded up the profile they had. Because you got to remember too, there was different. The techniques have changed at this point from what type they used in original DNA processing to a new one to the one we're on now.
Hey, David, so let me ask you this, just to quickly interject. So in 2000, you said in 2000 or 2001 is when they charged the profile of the John Doe.
Yes, let me double check my notes, okay?
But anyway, go ahead.
Yes, in March of 2000, Mary Long from OSBI, a PCR report was uploaded, which is different than the technique that's used now, but loaded a PCR report up of a profile that would be used to open a case up on a John Doe.
And so when they opened that profile up, March of 2000, am I correct? I want to make sure I got that number correct. March of 2000.
Mm-hmm.
When did they claim to have this, to get this match on Anthony?
Well, that's an issue right there from my investigation. So Anthony wasn't tested until October 22nd, 2004. So we're talking now 4 years after this 2000 profile by Mary Long, and also we're talking from 96 to there. We're talking now we're 8 years out from whenever the original crime happened against Julie Buskin. In 2004, from the buccal swabs taken from Anthony Sanchez were tested in another lab and came back and said, hey, we have a match in a CODIS. It was stated that a random search was done with profiles against and CODIS, and that they got a hit for Anthony Sanchez. One of the issues, if I can elaborate further on that, and this is where in this kind of case, timelines are super important. Out of all the cases I've worked as a private investigator and as an expert witness, one of the things we look at is timelines, because some things just don't match up and you need your timeline, because that's exactly one of the tools you'll use to place a person or an event or anything that took place. And it's really tough on investigators. Now, the longer a crime takes from the original date to later on, I mean, now you're just hoping that something comes up. But in this case, when they opened up that original case file, when they filed a John Doe, one of the first issues I said was when I heard that it was stated that they did that because of statute limitations. First of all, there's no statute of limitations on murder.
Yeah, I found that I found that to be very strange too, and I want to make sure that that's clear. You know, when they were talking about statute of limitations, again, there is no statute of limitations on murder. So it's very strange that they were talking about statute of limitations in the first place.
Correct. And then when they opened the case, when they made a case file on OSCN, March 20th, 2000, I just want to be sure about the date, because it was, March 20th, 2000, when they do this, there's several entries. So when you open a case file onto OSCN and you upload the documents, all the dates were the same. That case file or case opened, John Doe, the DNA profile. There's another entry, March 20th, 2000, for documents filed. On that same date, March 20th, 2000, a profile is loaded that says Anthony Sanchez. This is 4 years before Anthony Sanchez even has a DNA profile on record.
Wow.
And so when that date is set, when you make an entry on there, and because I've had to deal with this particular thing before, it creates, the date's already loaded. You load something, and it's there to track the case, and for court records, everything that's filed, it's part of the open records and public record information. And then it jumps back on that same date, the next entry, back to a John Doe. So my question became, how did they have Anthony Sanchez as a suspect March 20th, 2000 by name when they didn't even know who Anthony Sanchez was?
Right. Wow. That's a very good question, David. Yeah, it's just, I mean, there's certainly things in this case that just do not make sense. So, David, just pushing forward, when Anthony was told that there was a match and was pursued or whatnot as a suspect, it's very clear that he responds by saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you kidding? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. This is not true. I mean, he responds very, just intensely that he has no idea what they're talking about. And, it's interesting, too, at the time that, there's some kind of pushing going on in the sense of, the investigators, the detectives saying, well, you know this, or you did that, or we know this, or we know that. And ultimately, you've got Anthony, who, was a young man of color, at this time was in his 20s. At the time of the incident with Julie Buskin, he, having nothing to do with, I want to make that clear, having nothing to do with the Buskin incident, but just simply saying in 1996, Anthony Sanchez would have been 19 years old. So this is a young man of color, and it seems very apparent that the investigators and the detectives were pretty, pushy with him, to say the least. And during this time, it seems like the investigators missed a number of things, but it's very interesting how they put their case together. During this time, they claimed, and I want to go into some of this, David. They claimed to have had a shoe print that matched a shoe that Anthony would have had, and they claimed that this shoe print was a size 9 Nike shoe print, and they got his former girlfriend to testify that she had known about those shoes and that she had purchased them with him or for him 6 weeks prior to the murder. Well, the problem with that is that Anthony Sanchez, is a big guy and he wears a size 11 shoe.
Correct.
Have you ever seen somebody's shoe size change over time?
Not that dramatic, not that big of a number jump. Granted, you can have someone, scientifically, people can grow up to, males up to 25 years of age. However, not that dramatic of a jump, and especially considering the size, he wasn't even a size 9 at the time this would have occurred.
Right.
So the other thing is, I've dealt with cases. We had cases where there was shoe print that certain shoes have very distinct patterns. However, you're always going to have a hard time staying alone on that because those shoes, just like most shoes, unless they were custom made, they're mass produced.
Right.
And, you look at the time, not to age myself, but when I was a kid, PK Knights were the shoe. If you try to solve a crime off that shoe print alone, you're going to have a hard time because everybody wanted those shoes. And a lot of people wore them. But in this case, one of the things that gets missed is Anthony was known to be, when he had money, he bought stuff for himself, for his dad, for other people. And so there were shoes bought that, in one of the documents I reviewed, it was Anthony would take out people and do that stuff and buy shoes. But at the end of the day, he's still not the right size for the shoe. A size 9 is nowhere close to the size he was even at the time.
Right. Okay. And also, I wanted to go into another piece of this. We talked about the eyewitness reports, and it's very interesting that at this time, the investigators and later on the prosecutors, they don't seem to make a whole lot of hay about these eyewitnesses. At the time, when the incident happened, they put the sketch all over the place. But when they tracked down Anthony, again, the sketch seems to go in the background. David, is there any similarity between the sketch and Anthony?
That was one of the things, just to kind of back up, when I started case, one of the things that lawyers, especially if they want to work with me, will ask or anybody, I'll say, just give me the case, they can give me some names, but I don't like to be influenced by the information, so I just look at it. And the first thing I get emailed to me by the attorneys is this sketch. And as soon as I look at the sketch, I was like, this isn't even close to Anthony Sanchez. And in so many different ways. Anthony was you can look at his DOC intake sheets. He was a big guy. And, was not underway when you start talking about the sunken jaws, the length of hair, the structure. And here, the thing is, when you go back to Merriman, if Merriman can be so exact about the clothing and hairstyle and everything that Julie Buskin was wearing in her car, it seems likely that she's going to be very exact about the sketch. That's a lot of detail. I worked thousands of cases and had witnesses go from one side to the other about facts. In this case, she was very exact about that information. And when you look at the sketch, for one, the person's age bracket and everything, it does not match to the what Anthony would have looked like at that time. I've reviewed photos from that time of Anthony. I've reviewed the sketch and even other people that were looked at as potential suspects. And we were looking for somebody who was definitely older than Anthony was at the time, just by their facial structure. And there's just a lot of facts to it that didn't match up to Anthony. Like I said, Merriman was very exact about Julie Buskin. And the car, the details, like you said, to a T, she matched the hairstyle, what she was wearing at the time, her car. And so it stands to reason that when she's describing for the sketch and they show her the sketch and she says, yep, that's him, that she's just as sure as she was about Julie Buskin.
Right. It seems, it seems interesting to me that when we, later on at trial, when the sketch is brought up, these witnesses are never asked, is this Anthony? They never point at Anthony Sanchez and say, is that the guy that you saw? That question is never asked. But let's get to the trial in a second. But I also wanted to quickly push into there was a missing cell phone from Julie Buskin that was brought into evidence. And what they claimed that a phone number, the phone was used to call one of Anthony's friends. The problem with that is that it wasn't the exact phone number. It was a digit or two off. And it seems to me that there's no, the phone number wasn't used to call anyone that Sanchez or Anthony would have known. And so what was the phone used for during that time?
So not only did the phone call some random numbers. It was calling numbers that were associated back then with, especially at that time, we're calling it was like a phone sex hotlines.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of calls made, and they're random. And also, you look at the fact, there is an actual fact that you can put in there, a study of how many phone numbers are within one number of each other. And when you look at that number, it's astronomical. And the fact that what that's called is, when you're investigating a case, you look at everything. Everything is evidence until it's ruled in or ruled out. That's just how it is. So you'll have pieces that don't match up. But at the same time, to try to say, let me back up a little bit. One of the things as an investigator, you try to find different points that connect, just like forensic evidence. Forensic evidence sometimes is not what people think it is. It's supported by other evidence. It's great evidence. But again, it requires that, it was collected, documented, stored, and tested all properly. That's a big factor in it. But you want other things to support it. In this case, we call it trolling a case. It's where you start grabbing things and start saying, well, this gives it. Just like the shoe print not being the right size for Anthony. Then this phone number being, a digit off, and these other phone numbers. It'd been better back then, like how we have now, where you hit on a cell tower and you get a range, which can vary, but, other things that kind of dial it in. In this case, the problem is back to a timeline. The time the calls were made, Anthony, if it was Anthony, whoever this was, whoever had that phone was most likely not the perpetrator, because you can't be making the calls at the same time you're conducting an assault and murder. I don't believe you're stopping in the middle of it to make phone calls. And so that doesn't match up.
Right.
Somebody else has his phone while the other action is taking place. And one of the reasons we know that, the people in Julie's apartment heard a scream around 5:30 and called 911. Nobody actually sees Julie Buskin and what happens. From that point to the time the first eyewitness sees her and sees her vehicle is 40 minutes. So for 40 minutes, there's this somewhere that a lot of the action probably didn't even take place at Stanley Draper.
Right.
And then from her apartment, which I went and drove the route, went to the scene, all this, you're talking almost 20-minute drive, depending on the speed and everything. You can probably less it down to 15 minutes. And again, the person goes to a place that's not common. Like, we're not talking like a regular dock or just off a road. There's a pathway leading to, everybody has their, like, a fishing spot or places they're familiar with. Matter of fact, when I do homicide cases, sometimes even on cold cases, I'll say people will return to places they're familiar with, someplace they feel comfortable, somewhere, that can, you look at everything, that can be a factor. This location where Buskin was found is not just right on the general lake. That's why a person on a boat sees her across the way and thinks it's another boat or object launched there, and that's how she's discovered. But the cell phone part, I mean, that's a lot of conjecture to try to make it stick, because the fact that the numbers don't, match up to anything, the timeline isn't match up to. It just says it's not plausible that a person is in the middle of committing a very heinous crime and decides to stop and start calling phone sex numbers.
Gotcha. So the other thing that I wanted to push into before we get to the trial. So they also claim to have had a bullet, and Anthony's former girlfriend, who, this is the person who was already angry at Anthony. We already talked about being angry at Anthony. And, she says, well, Anthony and his father, Glenn, they used to live at this apartment, and they used to fire bullets into the wall. Very odd. Very odd. But investigators searched the property, and they didn't find any bullets. But then later, the landlord happened to find a bullet, and it matched certain characteristics for the bullet that had killed Julie Buskin. It seems to me like this is a, kind of a strange development. Tell us about this, David.
So this fact or information is also going to play a bigger part in the grand scheme of things, in the overall investigation. So that story is about Anthony's father, Glenn Sanchez, firing into a wall over being upset going to one of his rages that he was known to go into. And that this was, from a particular weapon that was similar to the one used to kill Joey Buskin. And that, and I've had that happen. I've gone on cases and went back to a scene and found things. It is possible. But right there in that moment in time, that should have been one of the indicators, and I believe it was. Based off some of the reports I've seen from detectives, there's a detective that saw things and had questions that seemed to go towards somebody other than Anthony. But once the case built, it's hard to say why, but it shifted again. But it wasn't based off an evidentiary finding. So when you have this, projectile, first off, one of the hardest weapons to distinguish in any case is a .22. Very small, and the softness of the projectile makes them very hard to track. It's why a lot of criminals go to that weapon, because it's a lot more difficult to track than it is, anything above like 9mm and that, because of it's just area of mass. If, very small projectile hits a hard object, tends to mushroom, depending on the type of ammo, whether you have ball ammo, whether you have, a hollow point or some other type of round. So in this case, they go, that's the landlord says, hey, I'll check, because they're talking about this wall that Glenn shot a weapon into. The problem with that is the focus was still Anthony in this, okay, so he's around a weapon. That's a huge leap versus a person who's already fired this weapon out of anger, versus saying, could Anthony have access to a firearm in this particular firearm? And there's nothing matching up that I've seen that says, yes, that same projectile is the same projectile or the same weapon, because typically you work off the casing more than anything. The casing will have striation marks in it, different variables to it that will tell you that it was fired potentially from the same weapon. Again, now we're back into mass production of certain weapons. There's very distinguishing firearms that are not that well known versus ones that are sold hugely.
Well, David,
sorry.
Go ahead, brother. Sorry.
If I, as the original investigator, this is taken from the way I was trained and where I'm at now. The minute I heard that, that's going to raise a question to me, because one thing we need to remember is what happened to Julie Buskin. This was a very violent and heinous type crime. When you deal with someone of this magnitude, you're often looking at a propensity, a behavior, something, because most people don't go out on their first day of this, this type of crime and go, she was bound and shot execution style, and it appears an assault was attempted, but it doesn't, the evidence I've seen doesn't suggest that she was actually sexually assaulted. It appears that somebody either tried to or was going to, but something interrupted or something else occurred. That's a lot for a person to kidnap somebody, take them somewhere, assault them, or attempt to, and then execute them. We're talking about a person who had some charges, Anthony, but not consistent with that. You're looking for a person with a violent past.
So let me, before we dive, I guess, deeper into the trial, how was Glenn acting around this time? I know that the investigators and the detectives had interaction with him. What was that?
Yes.
What was that like?
So the interview with Glenn Sanchez, it was, which I have the report. I don't have like the audio from it, but I have the report that was written by the detective based off the interview. Glenn was very defensive in his interview. He was also very, he did, repeated that he didn't trust law enforcement because of things he's seen. He did support Anthony, that Anthony, this wasn't consistent with Anthony. But there was a key point that he pointed to that jumped out when I read it. When he was asked about, did he ever go to Lake Stanley Draper? And he said yes. And from other interviews with witnesses and people in England, I also confirmed that it was common for him. It was one of his favorite places to go. As a matter of fact, he would take the back way between Midwest City to Norman, going through by Stanley Draper. The other thing was, he said that he had believed he had taken Anthony fishing there when he was younger. The detective reports and says that proves that Anthony Sanchez would have known the area. One of the things that was interesting, when they asked Glenn Sanchez, where did you typically go? When he points out the location, the detective reports that is right next to where they found Julie Buskin, which is a side road that leads towards the dam, but it's not like a common road. Matter of fact, back then it wasn't even marked with a sign. And Glenn Sanchez is literally telling them, this is where I like to go fishing. And he said, yeah, I probably took Anthony there. And the detective says, this proves that Anthony Sanchez would have known the area. That's possible, but why are you not catching that Glenn Sanchez knew that area better than anybody at this point out of the two? Because it was a location he chose. And it was literally right next to where they found Julie Buskin's body.
And so, did any of the detectives at this time suspect Glenn Sanchez?
There's a report that goes in. Matter of fact, not only to the detective, but Anthony's original attorneys. A lot of people had come to this conclusion that there's something weird about the way Glenn knows things about this case. And they don't say it in that report, but another detective later on will say, ask Glenn for a DNA sample, which he said no. He refused to give a DNA sample. Matter of fact, they wanted him to go talk to Anthony because he said Anthony would tell him the truth. And he never got back to him on it. And Anthony's original attorneys approached Anthony about the concept that, is there a chance Glenn would have done this? And as soon as they had that conversation, Glenn Sanchez sends a letter and does all this stuff, and even goes and sees Anthony, and he's, enraged that they would even think it was him. And Anthony, being his son, goes, I can't understand why someone would go near that thought. And that also will play into the totality of my investigation, from talking to family members and other people associated with Glenn and Anthony, that maybe they didn't have the information then, or it could have been tunnel vision, that they were focused on one thing. But there was a detective who asked Glenn, I strongly believe this detective started looking at Glenn because his knowledge of the area, his history of violence, his history of behavior, his familiarity with the information. So that gets back to the propensity, the likelihood, because again, we're talking about someone who ambushed, kidnapped, attempted assault, and ultimately murdered Julie Buskin execution style. That's a lot for a person. That is a very different mindset potentially of a person than someone who's alleged to be breaking into cars, which even on that with Anthony, there's no evidence to suggest that he was out breaking into cars. We're talking 5:30 in the morning in Norman, Oklahoma, when people were getting up for work, shift jobs, everything. I mean, look at the level of calls that went in over the screen. People were awake. That is an odd time to break into cars as well. So that you're talking just before you're waking up, your likelihood of being caught is definitely higher than if you would have done it at the peak times, which is between 12:30 a.m. and roughly around 4 a.m. So there was definitely some influence that thought it was Glenn or looked at Glenn, but it seems like it didn't go much further than that at that time.
And so, okay, so the trial starts, and there's no question that this is a sensational moment. News cameras, news crews from everywhere, and it just seems like Anthony's attorneys just function terribly. It's almost like it seemed like they were giving into these, what I would say is a very, very flimsy evidence, and they functioned as if they were trying to keep him from getting the death penalty, not necessarily that they were trying to defend him from the charges.
Well, I think matter of fact, like that report from 2007, I talk about with DNA, nobody really understood DNA. And the understanding we had is that if I have DNA, I have 100% of case. Because why would Anthony Sanchez DNA show up there? The question becomes about how to look at that, examine, or even weigh that evidence. In this case, nobody knew. I mean, outside of law enforcement or DNA labs, it was not very well known. Matter of fact, that report talks about how back in the early stages of DNA, nobody knew how to even question. You didn't know how to go and even question a lab technician because it wasn't out there with all the information about this is how DNA works. It was our understanding that if I get DNA, it's absolute.
Right. And of course now we know that the way the profile was collected and the way that the profile was identified, there's nothing absolute about it.
No, and that was, originally, matter of fact, some people that involved in Anthony's case had commented that one of the first things I said, the first document, I was asked to examine the DNA and get further samples tested, especially with the information coming out that Glenn had confessed to the murder of Julie Buskin. That could we look at and examine that? Well, one of the things that stands out is in all DNA they talk about outside of a direct family member, there's no likelihood. But, or typically there's very little likelihood that somebody else could be a match. That didn't come about until later on. It started in, I have to look back at my notes for sure, but Glenn didn't immediately come to that. It was, for one, we need to back up. Glenn Sanchez had a problem with alcoholism, as noted by all his family. He had a prior DUI, things like that. But he had never had a violent crime, so you couldn't, his profile wouldn't be on record. And a lot of the people that he had abused, Matt, never went forward to law enforcement. He was very abusive. Matter of fact, one of the recounts I had from family members is that he would beat Anthony so bad that Anthony ultimately quit school because he was missing so many days because he couldn't even get out of his bed.
Yeah, and we also know that he would put a gun in Anthony's mouth to threaten him to do certain things when he was a kid. We know that Glenn broke the jaw of Anthony's mother back in the 1980s. There's evidence that Glenn was known for pulling guns on people, and also that he would show up at random places and leave random places, and very much kind of a vagabond. It makes sense that that ultimately the reason why Anthony never suspects his dad or even lets them go after his dad is because he was terrified of Glenn. I mean,
yes, he was. Well, and he wasn't the only one. Many family members, ex-wives, and other people were very scared of Glenn.
Right.
Glenn was known to, for no reason, without being provoked, snap. And not just his violent behavior, he had very peculiar sexual behaviors, as noted in one of the interviews I conducted. Because, so, when I said propensity to a behavior. And so when I ask questions in an interview, I don't just sit there like a robot going through this list of things I want to know. Part of when we do interviews is relaying, listening, and then asking. As we went further along, I conducted 2 interviews on one person. And it started matching because, so one of the things that stood out to me was Glenn Sanchez was reported to have had an injury or an accident. And from that, he developed an opioid addiction. And one of the side effects of opioid addiction is erectile dysfunction that can occur. That stood out to me because you go back to Julie Buskin, when you look at the DNA evidence, they found the swab of her mouth, her vaginal canal, and her anal swab were negative for seminal fluid. Later, they would say, oh, yes, it was positive. That's actually not accurate. And it was brought up during trial with the DNA analyst that said, no, they ultimately, at first they said inconclusive, but the actual answer is they did not find seminal fluid in any of the orifices of Julie Buskin. And so what that, they did find it in what was spermatozoa were found in the panties of Julie Buskin and the leotard. That's an interesting point, and when you're looking at it from an investigation standpoint, that Anthony Sanchez had 2 children and one on the way. So clearly everything with him was working fine. What I said was, you potentially have a person who, for whatever reason, was interrupted or something didn't work. When I interviewed one of Glenn's ex-wives, I asked about, did Glenn have any issues in sexual performance? And she said yes. From time to time, he would have issues with erectile dysfunction. And I said, how did he behave when that occurred? And she said he would blame me. He would say that, I'm not doing it for him. He'd get very angry. And then she also documented about being forced to lay on the ground, face down on the floor, and about other things that probably are not appropriate to say where people are hearing, but things that are very bizarre and peculiar behaviors.
Including interaction with animals.
Yes. And now we're getting to a profile of a person who is very angry. You look at Glenn's response to law enforcement. His response toward when the shooting of the wall thing occurred over him being angry with Anthony over one of Anthony's girlfriends. And from a profile building and from my investigation status, or not status, but my investigating type, one of the things I look at, because I deal with a lot of abuse cases and domestic violence and sexual assault, human trafficking, and there's always a pattern of behavior. It's how we write and create a lot of the tools we use to assess domestic violence and abuse and assault. Glenn Sanchez has a chip on his shoulder against women. He also has signs of being jealous towards people that things work out for them, because everything in his life, he constantly relates to people, nothing works out, and he's angry at other people. He definitely showed signs of having a jealousy towards Anthony because Anthony had these women in his life, and Anthony was, a strong kid. So some of his behavior towards Anthony, this rage appears as a jealousy towards his son because of the fact that Glenn, in his mind, can't get where he's getting because of everyone around him, specifically the women in his life. That plays a big factor when you look at the violent nature and the horrendous behavior towards Julie Busky. And the fact is, so if you take that into account, and let's say that this is Glenn Sanchez. Glenn is not Julie Busky. If he cannot perform, that doesn't mean just because you have ED that you're not going to have spermatozoa coming out, because that can still happen. The problem is you can't get there, and that's pretty indicative of opioid behavior, especially if he's under the influence of alcohol, because now you're talking about a CNS depressant, a central nervous system depressant like alcohol, having an interaction with an opioid. I mean, you're going to have potentially psychotic episode type behavior. If you get into the fact that she wasn't actually sexually assaulted, but it appears attempted based off the clothing and other factors, and then enraged, as the witnesses have said that Glenn would become with them. I mean, we have reports of some of his past relationships waking up to being violated with the handle of a hammer. I mean, that is a very bizarre and violent behavior. So then you get back to how Buskin was bound and tied and treated. That is somebody who's got, that is a very angry situation. So if you take somebody like Glenn, who, let's say Glenn is the one who's doing this. If Glenn does this and he's angry because now it's not working, it's not like his ex-wives or people that he has a personal relationship with. The rage would go up, would increase, because it's her fault that he can't perform. Which
Right.
makes sense. And now, shooting his face, all that stuff. I mean, he's fired weapons, abused people in his own circle, his own son, his stepchildren, his ex-wives and girlfriends. There's nobody who interacted with him that didn't experience some level of abuse or violent reaction around Glenn Sanchez. And that to me plays a big factor, especially when you get back into DNA and how DNA relates to someone who is genetically tied to you. Matter of fact, that's why the DNA reports, even from OSBI and labs, say outside of a family relation, there's the likelihood of someone matching. And then when you go back and compare that to the DNA reports, that's where something stands out that is, stood out for me from the first day.
Right. I'm thinking about at trial, while the trial is going on. Again, Anthony is continuing to say, I didn't do this. This wasn't me. And the evidence that they put forward, in my opinion, is quite flimsy. But you have this moment towards the end of the trial, and which, by the way, I think it's important to point out that during the trial, Anthony was shackled. And so every time he moved, those chains were clanking against the table. This is a young man of color who was prosecuted in a lily white town at the time, or at the very least, a town that really viewed him as a monster. And they continued to do that, and they shackles, and he was very much monsterized. But at the end, after the verdict, he turns around and looks at the Buskins, and he says, "Mr. and Mrs. Buskin, I swear to God, I did not kill your daughter." And that is a moment that is just so powerful to me. And it has ran through my mind over and over again as I've interacted with Anthony. "Mr. and Mrs. Buskin, I did not kill your daughter." As time goes on, Anthony's appellate attorneys suspected that Glenn could be involved, not the least of which because Glenn kept on trying to insert himself into the case. And Glenn, throughout this time, was very determined not to let anyone get his DNA, which included swabbing different surfaces, burning clothes, really paranoid about somebody getting his DNA. Well, as the appellate process proceeds, and it becomes apparent that his appellate attorneys have kind of given up on the situation. They've done all of the appeals that they're supposed to do, and on some level they just kind of became comfortable waiting on him to die, it seems. So his appellate attorneys did not interact with him for 6 years, up until the spring of 2022. And so all throughout the pandemic, all throughout this time, he's having no interaction with his appellate attorneys, and there wasn't anything being done on his behalf. Well, in the spring of 2022, Glenn Sanchez commits suicide. He commits suicide on his girlfriend Charlotte's porch. And sitting there on the front step, he had been diagnosed with cancer, but during that time, he commits suicide. Anthony was devastated. Anthony very much loved his dad. And then I come in contact with the situation in September of 2022. And, just ministering to Anthony, I work with guys on death row all over the country. And when I encountered Anthony, I began to, go through the evidence and ask questions and kind of push into things, and I was like, this doesn't make sense. And I'll tell you the part that particularly disturbed me was the sketch. Seeing the sketch and saying, this looks nothing like Anthony. Like, this doesn't make sense that this sketch could be so far away from Anthony. Well, then I started getting indications from members of Anthony's family that I came in contact with. I started hearing snippets about Glenn. And then I ended up talking to Charlotte and Glenn's girlfriend, whom he committed suicide on her porch. And she revealed to me in a very vulnerable moment that Glenn had confessed to killing Julie Buskin. That on multiple occasions he had warned her, "I'm going to do you like I did that Buskin bitch," or, I listened to that Buskin bitch squeal, and all kinds of just horrible, horrible statements. And it was at that time that, again, we raised the money and got David involved. And it was from there that David did a formal interview Charlotte, and we began to do more and more investigation. And the more investigation that we've done, the more people we've talked to, the more it has become clear that this DNA situation could quite possibly have been a situation in which the DNA was close, but it was made closer either by error or by someone manipulating the results, which could very easily have made it look like Anthony was guilty, when in reality, Glenn was actually the one who was guilty. So I say all of this to say that we're now at a point where we have the Attorney General's office. We're months away from Anthony's execution, and we have the Attorney General's office making declarations that Anthony is a 100% match to the DNA that was found there near Julie Buskin, and that there is no way that it is anybody but Anthony Sanchez. And David, I wanted to give you the final word to respond to that.
Well, first off, again, since we talked about the DNA and the way it was collected and the outcome, it's not at that time scientifically or physically possible for Anthony to be a 100% match. They discussed fragmented DNA from spermatozoa. Fragmented DNA references the term fragmented means an inconclusive or missing parts of the genome that they did. So when you're talking about spermatozoa and you find a live cell and you separate the head from the tail and you examine that head, you get a firm sample. Whoever did this to Julie Buskin also had issues potentially with fertility. As I stated, Anthony Sanchez had children with one on the way. Anthony Sanchez had no issue with fertility. Secondly, the fact that Julie Buskin's DNA sample that's supposed to come from her blood and Anthony Sanchez, along with the other suspect, and Glenn Sanchez are a 30% match to each other from the sample, that's a problem.
Hey, wait a second. Are you saying, David, I want to make sure our listeners hear this. You're saying that Anthony appears to be a 30% match to Julie Buskin?
Based off the lab reports that I've seen. Now, we do not have the lab notes, and we do not have the benchmark, but we do have the report that was generated by Melissa Keith and turned over, where she created the columns and the values in them. And matter of fact, I brought in my team, which is made up of different experts, Tara Cardinal for domestic violence and sexual assault, Matt Davis, a former board-certified death investigator who worked for the medical examiner's office but assisted me in this case. We all reviewed it, and we each reviewed it independently, and all came back to the DNA being a problem. Because as it stands right now on that column, are those values for the testing that was done on the DNA, Julie Buskin, who is not a family member of Anthony Sanchez or Glenn Sanchez, is somehow a 30% match.
So a 30% match would typically be brother, cousin,
nephew, niece.
Yeah, so I mean that's just it's bizarre to even think that this DNA would say that Anthony has any sort of familial relationship with Julie Buskin when obviously that was not even close to the truth. They had no knowledge of each other, no family relations whatsoever. Go ahead.
One of the things that caused an issue when I started looking back, on that was there's a memo that is talking about the delivery of the evidence to Oklahoma City Crime Lab later on. And it says one envelope was dropped off with all these items in it. No pictures of how it was packaged, where each one individually. You're saying, basically off that report, they took all the DNA evidence, put it in an envelope, and delivered it to a crime lab to be tested. Now we have a new concern for cross-contamination.
Wow.
And that included Anthony's own buccal swab taken at the prison, put into an envelope, along with Julie Buskin. Now, Julie's was a blood sample, so her human vials and separately packaged. We don't know that, but the rest of the stuff, the leotard, the swabs from the leotard, everything are all in one envelope and delivered to Oklahoma City Crime Lab.
Wow.
I have never packaged evidence and put swabs inside the same envelope as other evidence for that particular reason. But again, we're talking back in those days. That's why the report came out in 2007 that discussed biological DNA evidence has to be individually. And I'm talking swab. When I swab a scene, each swab is air dried, placed into a container, then placed back into another envelope, and each swab is individually packaged. That's how thorough you have to be, because you take such a great risk of cross-contamination that we didn't quite understand back then. But nonetheless, the lab reports, and they're not even full reports, they are generated reports based off information that came out of the equipment, the lab, the computer, and then translated onto there. But when people were pressed about the answers, they admitted that it wasn't inconclusive. They didn't find it. You can do presumptive testing for seminal fluid and things and get a false positive. It does happen, and then that's why further testing is needed. And in this case, what you're talking about is quantifying a sample, being more direct and itemizing. But even to this day, they talk about the chances of mixed DNA, quantifying that sample and having an exact match to an exact person is in the ratio of impossible. And that's coming from current, we're now in 2023. Now, the only thing that is ever going to be clean is if I take a swab from your mouth and I test that swab, I'm going to have a profile on you because I have one contributor, one source. Look at how many fingerprints they found. Look at how many people they looked at for DNA. That tells you right there that they did not have an exact, and they also could not have done it in 2004. And so, as a matter of fact, in 2007 report, it said if you took 10 analysts and you took and gave them a finding, you'd have 10 different results.
Wow. So I had another question, David. So the recent press release of a month or two ago from the Attorney General's office said it was interesting. Of course, they said this was a 100% match. There's no way that this could have happened. No way, no how. But yet they did say that that Glenn Sanchez was a match to Anthony, and they could tell that Glenn was Anthony's father, which tells me that Glenn had to have been somewhat of a match to Julie Buskin.
Correct. And the thing is, that's why we talked about that outside of family or direct relative, that a person can be a match. And here's the other thing. Glenn Sanchez was called in on a prior cold case of a woman who was murdered and sexually assaulted based off a sketch. My wonder is if they ran Glenn Sanchez DNA profile from the medical examiner's lab that was taken when he killed himself in April of 2022 and put in a CODIS, would that match and solve that cold case that isn't far from Norman? But a witness and a family member of Glenn Sanchez, saw the sketch on the news and called it in.
Yeah,
we wouldn't have had a profile because none of his previous crimes were violent in nature, and even back then the act wasn't in place yet that guaranteed that violent offenders gave up a DNA profile.
Yeah, I mean we've definitely, that's an important part of this. I mean, we've definitely had folks who are who have suspicion that Glenn might have been involved in other murders and assaults as well.
At least two others against women. And if that was ran and checked, now we're back to propensity to behavior. Somebody built this. Somebody was building up in their profile. We talk about, like, one of the things that's hard for the everyday person to imagine, because most of us would never come near that thought, is how you decide to, just the cruelty of it. Kidnap, bind, attempt assault, and then execute somebody that you don't know for no reason, no pre-existing information that would give you anger towards them. We're talking about somebody who in their mind has a propensity to violence specifically towards women.
Right.
And that matches more like Glenn, because one thing you don't see from any of Anthony's exes or mothers of his children is violence.
Right. And I can attest to the fact that, I've spent a considerable amount of time with Anthony. I speak to him every night at 8 o'clock, and I know that this is someone who is a kind and generous human being. With that said, we're getting close to time. I mean, his execution is scheduled for September. We're obviously working as hard as we can to push back, but obviously that's an important part of this. But I think another important part of this, as we've just said, is that it is quite possible that if Glenn Sanchez is the killer of Julie Buskin, the state of Oklahoma, in their haste to pin Anthony Sanchez, perhaps gave room for Glenn Sanchez to have committed more murders. And so, obviously we don't know that yet, but I do want to point out that this is not just about Anthony. This is about the entire state and other families and other victims, quite possibly as well. Just to kind of conclude, I do want to state that we unequivocally believe that there is an innocent man on death row in Oklahoma, and we're going to continue to put out evidence and ways that people can get involved, and we are going to do everything that we can do to save Anthony Sanchez's life. And even more than that, to prove his innocence. I want to conclude with, first of all, thank you so much, David. David Ballard, one of the more amazing people I've ever encountered, amazing investigators, and has done such a great job with this. I also wanted to point out that, we